Is this thing?
Yes, it's working.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh. Well, you're
We need to hear you, not
your surprise is exceeded only by my own. My name is Alex Balashov, and I am indeed coming from Atlanta, where since about 2006, 2007, I've been involved in open source focused voice over IP telephony. Initially, consulting parentage, which is still reflected in the company name Evariste Systems. More recently, we have turned our direction toward a class 4 routing and switching product based entirely 100% on Kamailio. But the actual topic of this little symposium today is short duration dialer traffic, which I trust some of you are intimately familiar with, and I expect that those of you who are probably wish they were less so. But without passing too much normative judgment on the sort of thing that it is, I would like to describe it, talk about its formal and economic characteristics, and talk about how Kamailio can be brought to bear on some of the problems in that particular segment of the industry. Everybody hearing me okay? Okay, all right. Because this thing's like dangling, threatening to fall off. I don't know. All right. So-called short duration traffic, often referred to as dialer traffic, is traffic that has three central characteristics, two of which are apart from being short with respect to duration. There's no real widespread industry agreement on at what point short duration traffic is sufficiently short, but I would say that its average call duration is somewhere in the 6 to 30-second range, taking into account 6-second increment billing. That is still typical even in the wholesale industry. That's one aspect of it. The other is that, another is that a very low percentage of the calls are answered, usually 10 to 20, maybe at best 30%, 60% would be quite optimistic. So I will talk about this in the coming slides, but what differentiates it from the normal core business communication market of so-called conversational traffic associated with PBXs, for example, is that a very small percentage of the calls are answered. The calls are very short when they are answered, and they are, for that reason, are usually set up at a very fast pace, which challenges the limits of voice over IP software and other logistical components differently than, for example, a large number of concurrent channels. Typically, short duration traffic is generated by predictive dialing software or any sort of automated bulk dialing software for any purpose, as well as general blended call center software, which may incorporate a dialer component. Various call broadcast platforms, and what I mean by that is also a kind of dialer, but not in the conventional proper noun sense of the term. So, for example, broadcasters that, say, send out notifications for, I don't know, school closings due to inclement weather, or maybe some sort of civil emergency would be a call broadcaster. This is relatively common in the U.S. at least. And, of course, other miscellaneous business process and back office outsourcing companies that have some sort of outbound call automation component in their workflow. So what is this traffic? Where does it come from? Why would one originate outbound traffic terminating to the PSTN with this profile? For a variety of purposes varying in perceived social purpose and moral legitimacy. My aim here is to talk about this in descriptive rather than prescriptive terms, since whether we like it or not, it is a phenomenon that exists. The most common reason why short duration traffic happens is probably due to direct telemarketing and lead generation efforts. And of course, lead generation has come to encompass something quite broad nowadays. Anytime you've given anybody your phone number ever and they're somehow tangentially related to to someone with whom you've had a pre-existing business relationship or have ever done anything that could be construed as having in some way opted into the communication, makes you a lead. So straight up telemarketing is certainly a common endeavor for which short duration traffic is a transport, but also sometimes more kind of practically useful functions too. Appointment reminders. It's not uncommon nowadays, for example, for pharmacies to remind you to pick up your prescriptions, or doctors' offices to remind you that you have an appointment, using automated playback and robotic notifications of some sort. This also is traffic that has that kind of economic profile. Civil emergency notifications, as I mentioned. Those of you who are not from the USA may not realize this, but it's not terribly outside the realm of the conceivable for someone in an American university campus to just come in and shooting. In those cases, there is typically a legislative or regulatory mandate to call and or SMS everyone affiliated with the system, for example. And so it goes with companies and other large organizations. So a lot of call broadcasters actually, their business model is kind of insurance capacity to originate 200,000 calls in a minute if they so need to, if such a set of circumstances should transpire. Marketing surveys, and of course, political campaigns and research. As I understand it, in the European Union countries, generally political campaigning activity is restricted to within a relatively tight tolerance of the actual election time frame. In the US, that's not true. So for example, US presidential candidates have long begun their campaigning now, even though the election is in November 2016. And this is perfectly legal and results in a great deal of excess surrounding it, which spills over into the telephony industry in virtue of all the surveying that happens, since, of course, this is a very real-time poll-driven process. So, I'm going to briefly talk about its regulatory aspects. In the U.S., short-duration traffic is regulated by the Federal Communications Commission and the Federal Trade Commission. Some years ago, a do not call list was implemented, but practically it has a lot of exceptions and is adhered to varying degrees. The exceptions are, first of all, that they apply only to consumer residential lines, not business, and not-for-profit organizations can still call you, survey companies can still call you. Companies from which one has an existing business relationship up to 18 months after the last transaction are also allowed to call you, as are bill and debt collectors, which is a very well-developed industry in the U.S. The existing business relationship one is particularly interesting, since unless one is a kind of maybe bearded hermit that lives in a shack in the woods off-grid, most of us are perennially consigned to the state of having been in business with some company or another, for the last 18 months. And most countries' telecom regulators stipulate some sort of abandonment rate for these types of transactions. So, for example, a predictive dialer will call you, and in very rare cases where it's otherwise well-honed algorithms mess up in some way and don't actually connect you with an agent, that is considered an abandoned call, as are certain calls where you are eventually connected with an agent, but not very quickly. So predictive dialers are held to a relatively high standard of actually connecting a call center agent or a recording of some sort to a caller in the event that the caller answers. Generally, the FTC does not, in the U.S., countenance telemarketing calls to mobiles, which doesn't stop you from receiving them, especially since so many people have a mobile as their exclusive PSTN ligament now. And all these rules are adhered to varying degrees, especially by non-U.S. entities that terminate short-duration traffic into the U.S. The reason this presentation is called short-duration traffic on Kamailio and the Postal Service is I think that there is something quite similar happening in the fixed line PSTN, as happens to the Postal Service for quite some time now. My personal theory is that as a communication medium matures and advances through its life cycle, it increasingly becomes a vehicle for the conveyance of bad news and junk. I cannot say how it is exactly here in Western Europe, but I can say that in the US, it's been many, many years since I've received anything pleasant or worthwhile in snail mail. I believe that category of mail simply doesn't exist. 99% of my household mail is junk. Occasionally bills or letters from government agencies or maybe, banks or financial services companies that are still regulatorily mandated to provide this type of communication via paper. But in general, roughly half of the revenue of the U.S. Postal Service comes exclusively from junk mail. And in fact, if bulk advertising mail didn't exist, this organization would certainly not be solvent. And I think that, in as much as 95 to 98% of delivered email is spam, one can sort of extrapolate that snail mail has completed this life cycle, email is almost entirely along the way, SMS is still getting there, and newer forms of RTC, the spammers are still kind of in the incipient stage of colonizing them. I think the same thing is going to happen to the consumer PSTN. This is outside of the core market of, I think, most people in this room, which is business communication classic, which I think will stay relatively unchanged for quite some time. But for better or worse, bulk/dialer/short duration traffic is probably here to stay. I think that it will become more common unless, barring, of course, some very, very concerted regulatory effort to clamp down on it, which I don't think will happen. I can tell you that, for example, my parents in the U.S. have a fixed line still, and for about 10 years now, they've kept their ringer off because otherwise it would ring so often. They are on the do not call list and everything. And most of the calls that they receive are from companies with whom they could be construed as having some sort of business relationship or having somehow opted into those calls rather than straight up unsolicited telemarketing from strangers. So the only reason this doesn't happen to mobiles is because, strictly speaking, you cannot make such calls to mobiles, but that'll probably increase too. So the reason why PSTN terminating entities, meaning VoIP ITSPs that provide PSTN termination, as well as their oligopoly of suppliers at the top of that supply chain, really hate this type of traffic above all else. This is, removing any sort of normative, philosophical, or moral objections, is that its resource utilization is grossly disproportionate to the revenue that it generates because a very small percentage of the calls are answered, and only answered calls are billed. When the calls are answered, the average duration of the call is very low. So a typical conversational call in the industry is thought to be, 3, 4, 5 minutes long. I think 3 to 4 is kind of the rule of thumb. Whereas the typical short duration call is short duration. I would say maybe 20 seconds is fairly typical because in the vast majority of cases, the caller picks it up and says, oh, it's this robotic automatic call, click. And about in the time it takes for that process to occur, that is the billable duration of the call. And at the same time, because most of the business models involved in perpetrating such traffic upon the populace involve making a lot of these calls, partly for the reason that so few of them are answered, the high CPS load makes high demands on computing power, network bandwidth, and so on and so forth. And if you've dealt a lot with commercial soft switch equipment, SBCs, outside of the free and open source space, you will quickly come to the realization, I think, that it's actually very easy to knock a commercial soft switch from a mainstream vendor over with a relatively small amount of traffic. There's relatively few exceptions to that. The other reason why this traffic is not particularly well liked is that there's an increased liability and service burden due to the questionable content. So while in theory a common carrier isn't directly liable for the sins of the customers terminating traffic through them, in practice they will still deal with complaints due to harassing and unwanted calls. And this may even impact their peering arrangements, because if they start dumping too much garbage traffic to their peers, they may end up losing some of the interconnection terms that they fought so hard to get. And finally, the simultaneous call path and trunk usage of such calls is greatly outsized. And what I mean by that is, if you're in the conversational traffic space and you have 200 to 300 concurrent channels lit up for most of the day, then you're doing really well. That's a good problem to have. That's a fair bit of traffic. If you are an originator of short duration traffic, and you have 2,500 channels constantly lit up, most of these are call attempts in process and do not result in a substantial amount of billable revenue minutes. That's not a lot. And so, given that it's standard in the telecom world still to license various switching platforms and routing platforms on the basis of concurrent channels, concurrent ports, call paths, or some derivative thereof, it also means that if you're terminating short duration traffic, then you have to pay for 10 times the licenses, even though those ports result in relatively little billable revenue. Conversational traffic is much more profitable because, well, first of all, a certain percentage of conversational terminators are probably going to be paying closer to retail rates anyway, resulting on average in higher margin, whereas the business models of short duration traffic terminators rely overwhelmingly on very, very low margins and wholesale quantities. Average call duration is typically high. The percentage of calls answered, aka the answer-seizure ratio, is typically quite high. So higher revenue and gross margins per message signaling unit per call, no matter per license switch port, no matter how you want to break it down, per Ethernet cable connected, in all cases is significantly higher. It generates little controversy, and like I said, much higher revenue per port license or trunk. So just as an example of this, if you are terminating 200,000 calls daily with an average duration of about 3.5 minutes, 210 seconds, and 83% of them are being answered, and the average per minute rate you're charging is, let's say, 0089 in dollar terms, then you are going to bill about 500,000 minutes. You're going to bill about 3 minutes per call and book about $5,000 in revenue, with a typical revenue per call of about 2.5 cents. If you're a dialer vendor, it is far more typical for you, pound for pound, to generate about 1.2 million calls in the same interval, with an average call duration of 24 seconds and ASR of only 19%. So only 19% of these calls are even getting answered, because the rest of them, people pick up their phone, they see an unfamiliar number, I don't care, it's some bill collector, click. Or I should say they just click ignore. With a much lower typical rate, means that you're only going to be billing about 100,000 minutes, so less than a fifth of that. You're going to be billing less than a minute per call of the answered calls, and all in all, your revenue will be about 7 to 10 times less. This is, of course, using my hypothetical constraints and taking considerable liberties, especially with the dollar values of these calls. But the bottom line is it would not be atypical to compare two ITSPs side by side, where one specializes in short duration traffic and the other does not, and see these kind of results. So one is making almost 4 times more revenue per call and about 10 times more revenue per day than the other is not at all unusual. So in other words, in order to sustain a high CPS short duration business model, you really need to be pushing out a lot of traffic. And like I said, the other big factor here is that this latter business model typically requires a much larger number of concurrent channels and switch ports to be occupied, which, if you are being charged by a switch vendor on that basis, or you're limited by TDM trunks or what have you, in all cases, the resource reservation required simply to be attempting these calls in the first place is just grossly disproportionate and outsized relative to the revenue being realized. So the conventional approaches that mainstream carrier and PSTN terminating entities have taken to this traffic are the following. Some simply ban it. Some enact a punitive surcharge if certain percentage of your monthly or weekly or daily traffic is below some short duration threshold. Or they provide different pricing that is calibrated to reflect these realities discussed on the previous slide. or they require the customer to spread load across numerous gateways due to equipment CPS constraints. It's not at all uncommon in a wholesale PSTN termination provider to see someone say, hey, we have 4 data centers and 4 different SONICs, and we need you to spread your traffic across all of them, because if you send it to one, you're just going to knock it over. So that's another technical constraint and an economic constraint that governs this reality. Another way is to simply restrict the calls per second that can be initiated by a customer, or restrict them in a rather selective or adaptive fashion, depending on the overall traffic profile, using some sort of live computation function, or, as we are increasingly seeing, offload short duration traffic onto a lower cost platform and direct it to lower cost vendors. So in terms of who provides short duration traffic termination, there are some top tier feeders into the VoIP termination supply chain that actually have legitimate, in the sense that they have sanctioned them, dialer offerings, usually via special dialer oriented rate deck. But the vast majority of tributaries into the supply chain are actually aggregators and resellers, both of the reputable kind and the fly-by-night and, or I shall say, generic and unknown kind. And the reason for that is that that type of business model attracts a lot of relatively unsophisticated people looking for easy money. The common trait of aggregators and resellers is that they do aggressive LCR. They're expecting that you're going to be doing aggressive LCR. And what they're trying to do is, to some extent, thermodynamically impossible, and to some extent which is to provide a higher quality product by kind of summing together inferior components, meaning they want to take upstream termination providers, the vast majority of which are of kind of mediocre quality, and they want to give you a better product than would result if you were to send traffic to them directly. At least that's the more optimistic value-added proposition. This can kind of work as long as you have a technical apparatus that allows you to selectively cherry-pick the upsides of mediocre upstream vendors while aggressively eliminating the downsides. So the other thing about kind of generic wholesale termination providers is that they do seem to be uniquely attracted to dialer traffic, presumably because of its volume, as well as the sheer amount of it that exists in the world. They are generally operate at exceptionally low margins, even by the standards of wholesale PSTN termination. A lot of them are kind of one-man shows that don't really have a lot of infrastructure or integration capacity. And they are, in many cases, fond of so-called hosted soft switch products. So one example of a product that's aimed at this demographic is the Speedflow product. I think it's a UK-based company, is it not? So they actually have a PDF online called Guide to Starting Your Own VoIP Wholesale Business, which reads, to my mind, very much like a pitch for a multi-level marketing cult, or maybe as a colleague of mine referred to it as a how to shoot yourself in the foot guide. So you can see VoIP, they're telling everyone normatively that VoIP wholesale is becoming an increasingly popular business model nowadays. A lot of people have taken this message quite literally and have decided they want to partake of this gold rush, because after all, it's becoming quite a popular business model nowadays. So what do these guys want? They want technical features conducive to low margin arbitrage, which includes aggressive failover and route advancing. It's not at all uncommon for a dialer ITSP to have 135 million prefixes from 37 different vendors and expect to rapidly fail through 20 of them, 10 of them very quickly, as they all receive 503 service unavailable and whatnot due to very threadbare profit margin restrictions, since they're using suppliers that very much in form and substance resemble themselves. At the same time, they usually have an avowed commitment to the idea of route quality, which to them simply means ASR and the absence of undesirable traits like false answer supervision. This whole equation of harnessing the upsides of mediocre upstream vendors while eliminating the downsides relies on really kind of niche technical workarounds. Like many times when dealing with such ITSPs, we have faced with really peculiar requests that would, if this were conversational traffic, you would just say, well, get better vendors. Like, I love this vendor, I love their pricing, but when I send calls to Denver, Colorado, sometimes I get this bad media gateway IP, and we just know it's really bad. And can we add some feature where if we receive a 183 session progress with SDP answer that has this media gateway address in it, can we just cancel that branch and send the call somewhere else? They have a need for a complex business rules engine that consists of all kinds of improvisations like this. And of course, are very interested in profit margin enforcement, LCR engines that can limit their losses, eliminate fraud, and in short, try to achieve something, predict the unpredictable and achieve things that are to some extent thermodynamically impossible, but they do provide a source of much needed liquidity, one could say, in this market. So in contrast, the serious top of the supply chain that is interested in dialer traffic, they are more realistic about all this. They know that it's very low margin, but there is some revenue in it for them because they typically have, slack on their trunk capacity and a large footprint. They definitely want to grow their termination and infrastructure costs behind the low margin traffic, which is, of course, is going to be impossible with traditional kind of mainstream telecom equipment, just due to the licensing costs involved. They want to reduce their licensing costs and resource consumption. And of course, the human factor involved in support and troubleshooting and customer service for all this. And increasingly, we're seeing a trend where they just want to build parallel infrastructure out. In other words, they don't want to pollute their Sonus, their Metaswitch, and their Acme Packet conversational voice core with this type of traffic, period. But they would still like to dip their hand in this jar due to the sheer size of this revenue torrent as they see it, provided that they can do so at a lower cost basis, with, of course, a correspondingly lower commitment to quality and outcome, which paves the way for cheap technical solutions for low-margin, low-quality products. It is the very anticlimactic and prosaic economic thesis of this presentation. So, Kamailio-based solutions are particularly attractive to this segment for one simple reason, maybe a few simple reasons. Kamailio is overwhelmingly associated with high performance and high CPS handling, in stark contrast and contradistinction to the type of enterprise-priced equipment that you typically see in this space. In conversational business, having a mainstream convergent class 4-5 soft switch that can be knocked over with 40, 50, 100 CPS is not really a problem, because if you're realizing revenue over that kind of call setup flow with high ACD, high ASR, higher margin traffic, you probably can just horizontally scale them and just get another one. This is much more dicey with dialer traffic, where neither the margins nor the revenue typically support any extensive infrastructure commitment. So they want to do very much with very little, which presents an excellent market opportunity, I think, for those who are so inclined. The other thing is, Kamailio, of course, in virtue of the way it works architecturally, has very low overhead for high concurrent call paths. So you're not economically limited by Kamailio's exorbitant licensing costs per channel or per port, like in commercial soft switches and SBCs. And at the same time, you're not technically limited in the way that you are with a fully fledged, PBX or soft switch engine. Now, of course, nowadays, Asterisk and FreeSwitch have both made great strides in the number of parallel media paths and call paths they can support, and definitely numbers in the thousands for both of them now at a minimum. But with Kamailio, if you're not handling RTP, it can be in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions in principle, which is appetizing to the psychology of dialer traffic terminators. Low overhead failover across across serial forking branches, no RTP relay by default, is an attractive proposition to the psychology of folks who are in this business. Easy to integrate with outboard billing systems to which they're accustomed, which often operate on radius accounting. Free and open source licensing needs no introduction. And also, a peculiar trait of Kamailio, which again speaks very much to their taste for niche technical solutions to support arbitrage, is that Kamailio offers, it exposes a lot of low-level SIP attributes in contrast to higher-level applications like Asterisk or FreeSwitch. And certainly you can hack more and do more of the sort of hacking that they most want to do in order to achieve their perceived objectives of taking the good and not the bad and being extremely selective about their supply chain. The challenges, of course, are that the type of customer that is interested in this type of call processing solution is often looking for a turnkey VoIP business package that includes not only the call switching and processing component, but all the other back office components necessary to create a VoIP ITSP. They're often not especially technical and don't have the capacity for a great deal of system integration or process development required to realistically create such a business. And they are typically looking for an odd mixture of high-level user-friendly features for their outsourced offshore NOC, at the same time combined with the thematically improbable nuanced technical features to support aggressively failing over across a huge variety of low-quality termination vendors and networks. So anyway, bottom line is this. For better or worse, there's a lot of serious operators that are looking for a parallel platform to get this perceived low value or garbage traffic off of their high-quality conversational voice infrastructure. And there is a need for a large amount of concurrent channels at negligible marginal cost, which sort of flies in the face of the incumbent licensing model throughout most of the industry. And Kamailio is especially well suited to this this paradigm because it offers attractive technical solutions for both. It can function in many cases as a redirect server for existing components. There's a common design pattern in the industry of using FreeSwitch to process these calls, and then Kamailio as a cheap load balancer in front of it. And Kamailio, above all else, caters to an obsession with high performance and throughput, real and imagined, which is common in this market segment. And recent developments in the Kamailio ecosystem and feature set do seem to further enhance its appeal to this industry segment, especially the asynchronous processing features, which just means more CPS, and the RTP engine by SIPWise, which can accessorize both far-end NAT traversal and topology hiding. And I think that's it. Questions? Comments?
Question about that in traffic, short time. So then I'll have one. What would be the, I don't know, like the mechanisms you could use to limit? For example, I was in US, and then this is quite aggressive. And I know there are some legal limits, like putting, you don't do more than 100 calls at a moment.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you can share a bit more on this legal impact from the US perspective, or you are aware of this?
Well, there is a legalistic dimension to all of it, but I'm not privy to its intricacies. What I can say is that Kamailio does have two components that come heavily into play for any kind of restriction, both from a practical and a technical perspective. The major revolutionary change that has made Kamailio more relevant to this type of requirement recently has been the addition of dynamic pipes in pipe limit, since they can now be created on the fly and used to control CPS at a fairly fine-grained level. And of course, the dialog module and its ability to count concurrent channels is ever relevant. But those two features combined make Kamailio relatively effective for this purpose while managing a very large amount of calls.
Alex, quick question. You mentioned the obviously you talked a lot about short duration. I'm getting on two different DIDs. One is call-centric and the other is Google Voice. Calls that come in, if I answer it, it's silence and hangs up eventually after a little while. If I don't answer it, it's, goes to voicemail, but there's no message. Mm-hmm. What is the purpose of these calls? Are these is there some billing or arbitrage, or what do you think? You have any idea?
There's probably a lot of people in this room that are more equipped to answer that than I am. One speculation that I would immediately offer is that they're callback scams, and that if you, out of curiosity, call back this number, you end up calling a premium number, and for the time that you are calling them, they will bill you.
They are regular U.S., and they're all U.S. Originated area codes, but yeah, that makes some sense.
It's possible they're in high access areas.
Uh-huh. So arbitrage again.
That would be my first guess. Yeah. But really, it could be a variety of other things.
I think, at least from my opinion, because I get some calls like that, might be something with voice detection. So if you don't speak, practically it's an automatic dialer, which has some voice recognition, and then they hang up when they detect it's like a robot or you don't speak.
Yeah, but I've tried everything. I've tried hello, and at the early days I used to actually speak, and then I let it go and see if it was a message, robotic. I don't know. Somebody must be trying to make money because I get hundreds of them, about 3 or 4 a day for years.
Well, okay. Thank you, Alex. Thank you for coming. And now we'll have the most interesting